Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here with you again, and of course with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, hey, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, while they were campaigning in New York, decided to go visit a public housing project. And so I thought, well, this is a nice opportunity for you and I to discuss something that we haven't discussed before, public housing. It's a classic socialist program. It's a government-owned project. It traces back, not surprisingly, to Franklin Roosevelt's economic revolution known as the New Deal. And it has all the characteristics of a socialist program. Poor quality, dilapidated housing, and the housing that Sanders and Clinton visited was like the epitome of dilapidated housing. The guy had been killed there a couple of years ago. I mean, and that's characteristic of public housing projects too. A lot of violence and drug dealing, and I mean everything that you would expect of socialism is right here in these public housing projects. And yet, what is the solution that Sanders and Clinton bring? More socialism. They said all we got to do is spend more money. That they told them when they visited that project that they needed like $17 billion, and boy, they both promised that, hey, we're gonna bring more money into public housing. Well, after all, it's campaign season, so that's when you start promising the candy. And no, it's not bribery, Richard. It's not buying a vote. It's just making some pledges that are part of the campaign, just like they do in Latin America during campaign season. So classic socialism, classic campaigning, promising to give out the candies, and of course everybody ignores the real solution, which is libertarianism. What do you think?
Well, I think the irony is that you've alluded to is that they go to a government-funded, government-built, government-maintained housing project that is socialist housing, as you correctly pointed out. And what conclusions do they reach? There's nothing wrong with government housing. All that it needs is more money. In other words, it's not as if they went to a private housing complex and said, oh, look how bad the conditions. If only the government took it over, it could be managed properly and with a healthful and nice environment. No, the irony and the perversity is they go to one of the government's own housing projects and say, this is the failure, but of what? Not of the government managing residential housing, but a failure of not taxing the citizenry enough to pour even more money down a public housing rat hole. You know, this has been a dilemma and a problem that right-thinking economists have analyzed and understood and attempted to criticize for decades. There was a well-known economist named Martin Anderson in the 1980s during the first Reagan administration. He was one of Reagan's staff members and then was later a senior scholar with the Hoover Institution out in California. But his first sort of recognition for public analysis was a book that he wrote in the early 1960s called The Federal Bulldozer, how government would come along and wish to socially engineer communities and neighborhoods and cities. And one way of doing it was to condemn private housing, residential housing, or other structures, tear them down, and then build these government housing projects according to central plan, and then feed people into them in these crowded spaces in which the government managed them in a slipshod way. People had no incentives of maintaining or caring for the buildings, and therefore they became derelict areas with crime and filth of various and sundry types. A perfect example of what is called the tragedy of the commons. When something is owned by everyone, it is therefore owned by no one. And when something is not owned by someone who, while bearing the costs, can also reap the benefits. No one has a motive and incentive to maintain care or improve it. This is a phenomenon that I witnessed too, if I can use that kind of comparison, Jacob. When I was traveling in the old Soviet Union, maybe some of the listeners and viewers know that in the early 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was traveling there doing consulting work on market reform and privatization. And I traveled quite a bit and came to know fairly well a variety of areas and districts in Moscow. And all of them were nothing more than these public housing multi-level projects. And what did we see? The same thing that you see in New York. Since the state owned it, the state was responsible for its management. And the bureaucrats had no incentive to do anything than following some minimal standards not to upset or rock the boat or get an objection from the person further up the food chain in the bureaucracy. How did people treat these buildings? Well, they tried to maintain their own apartments. That's where you're living. Even if you don't literally own the apartment, it's your space. And most people like to keep their own space fairly neat and clean and habitable. But the building itself, the hallways, the stairwells, the elevators, the lighting, were cesspools of filth and dirt. People urinating in the hallways, the elevator becoming unworkable because people would steal the motor for some private black market purpose. Crime and infestation of pests and bugs, a total disaster. So there we saw socialism in the land of socialism. And here we have seen now for several decades, well over half a century, the same process in American cities with a copying of Soviet-style housing with the exact same effects. Deteriorating buildings, elevators that often don't work, urination or even worse in the hallways and the stairwells, places of crime, and people having a sense of fear and fright and intimidation of just going in and out of the buildings. That is what the government has created with this. Now compare that to private housing, whether it's your own personal house or whether you own an apartment complex, and whether it's a luxury apartment complex or a more modest one for lower income residents. The fact is, it is the source of your stream of income. You have an incentive to maintain and care, and in many instances even improve the facilities so as to guarantee two things: a stream of revenue for people who are desirous of living in your apartments, your stream of revenue income, and there is always the possibility that you might want to sell the building, and therefore you're concerned with its resale value. Now, depending upon the clientele and the general neighborhood, that resale value may be greater or smaller, as is always the case in these circumstances. But whether greater and smaller, to the extent that there is a positive resale value, the owner of the residential housing complex has a motive and incentive to maintain, care, and improve it so as to maintain his income stream and its resale value. None of these things are present, Jacob, in the case with government housing, because again, when everybody owns it, nobody's owned it. And the bureaucrats have no motive incentive. It's not their property. If it deteriorates, if it's unsafe, unless it becomes egregiously so, and politically someone upstairs starts, coming down on your case, it doesn't matter. I followed the rule book. I went around and occasionally examined it, and they all seem to be meeting the minimal standards. Or if you want me to do more maintenance, well, you have to add to my branch of the bureaucracy and allocate more money. And that is a tragedy with this. And as a result of this, in the name of helping the poor, putting a roof over the head of the needy and the low income, the government has created a housing climate in which those in most need and financially least well off live in the most disgusting and contemptible housing because of the state itself.
Yeah, your point about how they purport to help the poor is absolutely excellent, because they actually do the exact opposite. It's all part of this, war on poverty nonsense. It started with Franklin Roosevelt, but really reached its peak with Lyndon Johnson. Notice, along the lines of what you're saying, is that whenever they have built these public housing projects, the government remains the owner. Now, the last thing I'd be in favor of is giving housing away to anybody, but why don't they at least do that? I mean, if they're going to give housing to somebody, why not vest title in the person? Whereas you point out, the person now owns it. He's going to take care of it. If he decides to sell it, he can keep the profits from the sale. But notice they have never done that. They always insist on the government remaining the landlord and the poor person being the tenant. Why do they do that? Well, to create the sense of dependency on the government. That people in public housing projects will tend to vote for whatever candidate is promising to keep that public housing project there. Nobody wants to be thrown out of his house. So if there's any sense of waves being made by a candidate who's saying, look, we don't need this junk, this socialist junk, well, he's not going to get the vote of that public housing person because the public housing person wants to remain in his house. So you create this sense of dependency, of hopelessness, of not being able to break out. Because here's another factor here. And I learned this when I was in Laredo, and I was I was a lawyer then, I was representing a couple that was living in a public housing project. In fact, the first public housing project in Laredo, and one of the first in the country, that was brought into existence by Franklin Roosevelt, and ironically, that my grandfather in Laredo helped to build. But what this couple told me was that if they made too much money, that they'd be thrown out of the public housing project. And so what they were doing is working jobs on the side and illegally so that they wouldn't get thrown out, because there's this gap where they didn't have enough money to put a down payment on a house, and the government would not let them make too much money, so they were effectively consigned permanently into this public housing project, likely for the rest of their lives, where they remain within a certain income bracket, in other words, poor, for the rest of their lives. And so you have this phenomenon of people living there all their lives and then passing it on to their children, intergenerational matter. And so this is the way you help the poor, by keeping them poor, by keeping them dependent, by keeping them helpless and hopeless. I don't think so.
Well, if I can just sort of build upon what you've just said, there are two instances in which the apartments were privatized. One was under Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. She turned the government housing in many instances into condominiums. And interestingly enough, the same thing was done in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. In both cases, the apartments were turned over to the residents. This was now their private apartment, like a condominium. Now, in Great Britain, as I understand it, not only the apartments were privatized, but the building complex became the property of joint ownership of the tenants. So that not only did people have a motive and incentive to maintain, repair, and improve their apartments, both for the pleasure and the convenience and the enjoyment of living in that room space, but also, again, like with any condo, its resale value and the maintenance of the buildings that now the residents jointly own. Now, the comparison is with post-Soviet Russia. There, the apartments were privatized, and what did you see? The same incentive mechanism. People improved, added to, enhanced the design, the shape, the internal quality and features in the apartments. But the buildings remained and remain in the hands of the Russian government, in this case, the municipal government of Moscow. So what happened? You have nicely redone apartments in Moscow, but the buildings themselves, since they again remain the property of all and therefore under the ownership of none other than the bureaucracy of the city government, continue to be in this condition of dilapidated, deteriorating condition with disgusting hallways and elevators and stairwells and unkept grounds around the building. Where private property is established, you give people a sense of ownership. It is theirs. And with everything else that is your property, you have a motive and incentive to maintain it and properly use it, precisely because you bear the consequences, the costs, if you fail to do so. Those are lessons in there. Now, if something were to be done such as this in the public housing projects of the United States, privatizing the apartments as condos. As in the British case, as I understand it, privatizing the buildings as well as sort of the joint property of the condo owners, where then they would arrange to hire people to maintain the building on their behalf. Because surely the value of the condominium in the building is partly the function of the quality of the maintained building itself in which the condo sits. Now, if something was done like that, some model version of that, I would suggest that in a reasonable period of time, even for those on relatively lower modest incomes, you would begin to see slowly but surely improvements and repairs and improvements in the buildings and in the apartments in which they live.
I don't think there's any question about it, but then the government loses control over those people. And I think that's what this is ultimately all about. It's a way to put people under the control of the government. That as long as the government's the landlord and can kick them out, people are going to be subservient, compliant with whatever the government wants. But notice their solution, the solutions of Sanders and Clinton and people of that ilk. They say, we're going to give you more money. I mean, it's always the classic problems of how to deal with socialism. More socialism. They're going to tax people. Well, of course, most likely they're going to say, we're going to tax the rich. And so that creates that sense among the poor people, oh, the reason I'm poor is because all those rich people have a lot of money. But, boy, I like these Democrats because they're going to take away money from the rich and they're going to give it to me by improving my housing. When actually, Richard, the taxes start falling on everybody. I mean, that's what they promised originally with the income tax, that it would only be on the rich. But look, the middle class is suffering now, and the people who end up suffering from an economy that's depressed are ultimately the poor. I mean, it's the rich that provide the capital that makes people more productive, that open up the businesses, that bring goods into existence that are luxuries today but become mainstream goods for everybody tomorrow. So, in other words, there's no disharmony, as the socialists often say, between the rich, the middle class, and the poor, that everybody has the same harmony of interest, a booming, dynamic economy. And but by taxing everybody, you end up depressing economic conditions, which then locks the poor even more into poverty. Or they borrow the money. I mean, where are they going to get this money? The government's already spending $500 billion more than what it's bringing in. The debt ceiling continues to be raised, enabling them to add to the already existing mountain of debt. The Fed will ultimately monetize that debt with devalued currency, which especially hurts the poor. So their mechanism itself, not only does the public housing itself hurt poor people, the mechanism for dealing with the horrors of public housing are also falling disproportionately on the poor.
I would point out that all of these issues that we've been talking about and you've just raised about the motives and incentives on the part of those in political power, it really brings out the importance of the power of ideas. Now, I have no desire to make her into some type of icon the way many conservatives have. And she certainly was far from perfect in many policy areas. But the fact was, Margaret Thatcher believed in free market principles. She grew up in a household of a small enterprise father, a grocer. She understood the importance and the incentives of owning a business, having the property as your own. They lived over the grocery shop, as I understand her biography. So she had all of those middle-class, commercial, enterprise values from her youth. And she went into politics and then reinforced that with, in fact, reading people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. Now, again, I'm not placing her as an icon on a pedestal, but someone in political office who has been influenced and believes in these ideas will attempt, if they can, to obviously move policy in a better direction. And she believed, from her own personal experience and her philosophic perspective, that if you turned these public housing units over to the people who resided in them, you would create those positive incentives to maintain property, improve property, to take pride in property. And of course, you also hope that one's owning property and therefore having something to lose from redistribution of wealth, that they might vote for the Conservative Party instead of the Labor Party. Okay, fair enough. But it shows the importance of the power of ideas. And even when a political leader has such ideas and is willing to attempt to implement some of them, that's the power of ideas at the end of the day.
Absolutely. But let's go back to a negative example, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, this is where all this started, among the progressive movement, the idea of public housing and Social Security and later Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, it's the whole philosophy, Richard, that government is supposed to be taking care of people. And that's not what America was founded on. America was founded on people taking care of themselves, either through their own efforts or through voluntary charity. It was supposed to be a society based on free markets and free enterprise. And when somebody might ask, okay, well, how would a free enterprise system deal with the needs of poor people that need housing, low-cost housing? Well, I'll give you an example of this. You know, I mentioned that I lived in Laredo, my hometown. It was on the Texas-Mexican border. And the Census Bureau told us in the 1950s that Laredo was the poorest city in the United States. Well, after I went back there after law school to practice law, one of our clients in our firm was a guy who built low-cost housing. And it was absolutely fascinating. He kept his costs low by going and buying materials in Mexico so that he could charge the cheapest possible price he could for his housing. And his apartments, you could rent them for a day, a month, or indefinitely. But what they were, now, they were not, you know, the Hyatt Regency or anything, but they were clean. They were well kept. Everything was first class, even though the materials had been brought cheaply. But what it was a stepping stone for people, that they'd come in and they'd rent this apartment for a few months at a very inexpensive price. Then they'd build up a little nest egg and they'd move out and move into a little bit nicer facilities. But it showed me that the market really does work, that you'll have entrepreneurs in there that are not only building the mansions for the very wealthy, but are building the low-cost housing for poor people, not because they're trying to help the poor, but because this guy was making a lot of money off renting this low cost housing. But it showed me this confluence of interest in a free enterprise system where you can have housing for everyone based simply on people seeking their self-interest.
Mm-hmm. We should not also forget that part of the housing problems for lower income city dwellers is not independent of zoning laws and other regulatory restrictions that make it difficult for home and residential housing developers to have a greater flexibility in markets, in selecting locations, in being able to renovate buildings, even for low-income housing, not just always gentrified or higher residential housing, and also not to be burdened by the costs of construction and building maintenance regulations that the government heavy-handedly places upon those sectors of the economy. All of those things, zoning laws, building and construction regulations and standards, all of these are reinforcements of the problems of the market's provision of housing for those in low-income brackets, in addition to the siphoning off of wealth and putting people in this public housing, as you say, to make them political dependents.
That's a great point. I mean, and you see this especially with respect to mobile home parks, where this is low-cost housing. This is the way people get started in life, and many times. And then you've got the political powers that pass these zoning laws that essentially lock the mobile home parks out of the community. Now, notice what the market does, though, is that as wealth develops in a society or in a community, you can start having housing developments that have their own covenants in terms of what kind of houses are going to be built there. And that's just a reflection of the higher degree of wealth in that society. But over in the rest of the town, the government has absolutely no legitimate moral authority to be passing zoning laws saying, well, this is what we think should happen here. Because, again, Richard, it's that old concept of the central planner, that he knows best. And what he actually ends up doing is he hurts those people at the bottom of the economic ladder by locking them out of multifamily dwelling type opportunities or mobile home parks and the like.
I agree. And I think for listeners or viewers who are interested in these issues, it's worth pointing out that while she herself was really not a libertarian, she wrote from a perspective certainly compatible with libertarian thinking on these housing issues. And that was the writer Jane Jacobs with her books on the rise and fall of cities and a variety of other books on the same themes. And I might also mention an Austrian economist named Sanford Akita, who teaches at SUNY Purchase in New York, who has developed a variety of these themes on the spontaneous development of urban areas versus the rigid central planning mentality of those who impose zoning and other regulations on how they think cities and towns should develop.
Yeah, that example of Jane Jacobs is fantastic because, I mean, she was really fighting a heroic battle in New York City against urban renewal. Another socialist type concept where the government comes in and just starts bulldozing everybody's houses, pays them a pittance with respect to eminent domain, all with the idea that we're going to get rid of blight in the community. And then they just throw these people out and say, hey, go fend for yourself, go find a new house, here's a few dollars to help you out. While Jacobs was pointing out that these were intricate neighborhoods that were forming among the poor, and that sometimes the children of the poor would break out and they'd move into a better neighborhood, but that you had all these intricate relationships that were developing that the central planner would see as blight, and they saw as, no, very, very interesting, dynamic relationships that were taking place and economic relationships that were taking place in these neighborhoods. And then urban renewal comes along and destroys them, throw these people out, all in the name of helping them, but really destroying them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The terrible thing that has happened with urban areas, not just here, but in obviously other places in the world, is this belief that cities should be built by design before people either move in at all or have significantly moved in. That should be pre-imposed upon the shape, design, the features, the characteristics, and the uses of a geographical area, rather than allowing the city to grow and take its form, its patterns of what is where and being used for people for what, guided by what people find useful, guided by their personal preferences and their market opportunities. And therefore, unfortunately, modern American and many other cities around the world are unnatural. They are the products of the social engineer who imposes a design as opposed to allowing society to spontaneously develop cities and communities the way people would naturally, both intendedly and unintendedly, would bring them about through their own interactive processes and changes through time.
Yeah, and hopefully shows like this and the libertarian ideas will bring people's mind around to the idea that there really is a solution to all this socialist morass. And that solution is libertarianism, free markets, private property. And if people ever regain that sense of private property and free markets, I think we can see a major transformation in American life in a very, very positive direction. In any event, Richard, we're out of time for this week, as always, and greatly enjoyed the show with you.
It was wonderful, and I want to thank our viewers and listeners for taking time out of their day to share it with us.
And I thank you all, too, and we'll see you next week.